Fabled Heat, where magic meets desire. Subscribe to ignite the fantasy.
The chipped ceramic warmed my palms, a pathetic attempt to ward off the November chill that clung to the citadel's stone walls like a damp shroud. But the cold wasn't the source of my unease. It was the memory, vivid and insistent, of our first encounter. The way Ryder's gaze had pinned me across the briefing room, a spark igniting that had nothing to do with the holographic projections. A slow burn that still heated my skin, making my cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anticipation. I inhaled the spiced cider, the sweetness doing little to quell the tremor in my hands as I thought about the way his eyes seemed to see right through me. I could almost smell it again, the sterile scent of polished steel and ozone, the faint undercurrent of something wild and untamed that always seemed to surround him. His presence was intoxicating, a blend of danger and desire that left me breathless. I remembered the way his power shifted, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a flicker of glacial blue in his eyes. Those eyes assessing, piercing, and yet burning with a hidden fire that both captivated and terrified me. He'd straightened, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of contained strength, not towering like some of the enhanced soldiers, but lying coiled, a predator barely restrained. A shiver traced its way down my spine, and I deliberately lowered my gaze, pretending to study the mission parameters, a foolish attempt to ignore the magnetic pull between us. I hadn't needed the data to know my life was about to change. As I stood there, the silence between us grew thicker, like a challenge waiting to be accepted. I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his attention like a physical touch. It was as if he was waiting for me to make a move, to acknowledge the spark that had ignited between us, but I was frozen, unsure of how to respond. The memory of that moment still lingered, a haunting reminder of the connection we shared. I thought about the way he moved, the fluid motion of his body, the way his eyes seemed to bore into my soul. It was as if he could see right through me, to the very heart of who I was. And yet, despite the fear that gripped me, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. There was something about him that called to me, something that made me want to surrender to the desire that burned between us. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor. They were heavy, deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I felt a surge of adrenaline course through my veins. I knew that sound, knew that it was Ryder approaching. I could feel his presence like a dark cloud looming on the horizon. And yet, despite the fear that gripped me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. What would he say to me? Would he acknowledge the spark that had ignited between us, or would he pretend that it didn't exist? Questions swirled in my mind like a maelstrom of uncertainty. And then he was standing in front of me, his eyes burning with an inner fire. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and husky. "Thinking about what?" I replied, trying to sound nonchalant despite the fact that my heart was racing. "Our first meeting," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "The way you looked at me, the way I looked at you." I felt a flush rise to my cheeks, and I knew that I had been caught. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to sound convincing, but Ryder just laughed, a low, throaty sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't play games with me," he said, his eyes burning with intensity. "I know what I saw and I know what you felt. You can't deny the connection between us." I felt a surge of fear mixed with a sense of excitement. What was he proposing, and what did he want from me? The questions swirled in my mind like a vortex of uncertainty. And yet, despite the fear that gripped me, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. There was something about him that called to me, something that made me want to surrender to the desire that burned between us. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryder's eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire, and I knew that I was in trouble. "I want to know you," he said, his voice low and husky. "I want to know what makes you tick, what you desire, what you fear." I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew that I was in danger. But I also knew that I couldn't resist him, couldn't resist the desire that burned between us. "And what if I don't want to know you?" I said, trying to sound brave. Ryder's eyes seemed to glint with amusement, and I knew that I had been caught. "You do," he said, his voice confident. "You want to know me just as much as I want to know you." I felt a surge of fear mixed with a sense of excitement. What was he proposing? And what did he want from me? The questions swirled in my mind like a maelstrom of uncertainty. And yet, despite the fear that gripped me, I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. There was something about him that called to me, something that made me want to surrender to the desire that burned between us. As I stood there, lost in thought, I knew that my life was about to change. I knew that I was on the precipice of something new, something exciting, and something terrifying. And I knew that I couldn't resist the desire that burned between us, no matter how hard I tried.